Very good to be with you all. My name is James Orr. I'm an Associate Professor at the University of Cambridge. I come with good news and bad news across the Irish Channel. The good news is that we've been fighting the good fight. We've had some battles to endure, but we have, after 3 or 4 years, won some legislative victories. The British government passed last year the Freedom of Speech Higher Education Act 2023, which is coming into force on the 1st of August, and that puts special statutory obligations on universities to promote and protect freedom of conscience and freedom of speech. The bad news is that the Scottish Government has just passed hate crime legislation very similar to what is being proposed here in Ireland. And so we are in the paradoxical position in the United Kingdom where in the universities, from the 1st of August, you will be able to sue a university if it does not protect your right to express a view that from the 1st of April is going to get you arrested in Scotland. So much for our union and so much for our United Kingdom. So it has been fascinating to watch these debates evolve here across the Irish Channel, and it's very good to be with you indeed. And one of the fascinating features of the debate in the UK has been the way in which this extraordinary coalition of people have come together. People who, I think 5 to 10 years ago would have been able to engage in nothing more than a dialogue of the deaf. But I'm delighted to say we've got with us tonight two people from very different corners of the spectrum, two different ends of the spectrum, who have been so important in fostering and incubating debate and challenge to the increasing coercion on freedom of speech in the UK. We have with us Andrew Doyle. Andrew, after applause like that, clearly doesn't need any introduction at all. Andrew has been a fearless warrior for free speech over the last few years. He's the author of The New Puritans, which is one of the best manifestos for freedom of speech, one of the best diagnoses of what's going on in the UK and beyond here in Ireland. We're seeing the phenomena too, of course, across the Atlantic and in Europe. And he has been, we were talking earlier about the sort of the grip on the narrative that the mainstream media has and the extent and the fear that you can feel that it is losing that grip. And one of the most exciting things on the media landscape in the UK in recent years has been the arrival of GB News. And in particular, on Sunday evenings, Andrew's show, Free Speech Nation, in which he tackles these issues fearlessly and brings on people like Lorcan and others and some of the people who will be speaking here tonight to really diagnose and dissect what's going on and to really get under the skin of the problem. So it's great to have Andrew with us. And secondly, Laura Perrins. Laura is a barrister, broadcaster, journalist, someone I've been reading for many, many years. In fact, I remember 10, 15 years ago reading her and thinking, gosh, is it really as bad as she thinks? Is this stuff really going to happen? And I've got to say she's one of the great prophetic voices in the UK. She writes for the Catholic Herald and she writes for Gript here in Ireland. And for the Conservative Woman. So would you please welcome Andrew Doyle and Laura Perrins? Well, let's kick off. I mean, Andrew, you're in a special position. You're a writer, you're a broadcaster. You've been in these battles for a number of years, and you have, in the Avatar and through your good friend Titania McGrath, really come to understand the kind of progressive authoritarianism that is sparking these challenges to freedom of speech. And so what have you found to be the most sort of useful techniques to respond to this culture of censorship?
Okay, personally I feel that the best way to approach it is to have a kind of root understanding of where it comes from, why it's here, and what form it's manifesting in at the moment. And I've just read a book by Alec Waugh, brother of Evelyn Waugh, and it's a travel narrative written in 1952. And he's talking about the island of Mahi in the Seychelles, and he's talking about the expatriate community there, and in particular an anti-communist crusading woman who he calls the Colonel's Widow. And this woman is caught taking books out of the library, like the Communist Manifesto or Das Kapital, and creating her own homemade firelighters with the books, and actually just pretending she's lost the books and giving money to the library that she can't afford. And when she's caught in this, she's confronted, and they say, why did you do this? And she said, well, what you've got to understand is communism is censorship. Communists censor artists, and that cannot be allowed. And the author says to her, but aren't you practicing your own form of censorship by preventing people from reading these left-leaning books? And she says, yes, but the difference is this is a poison, and we have to stop this poison. And this really resonated with me because recently, over the past few months, I've noticed this kind of inconsistency when it comes to this principle of opposing authoritarianism. So, for instance, I've heard left-leaning people say that we should censor the speech of the right, or left-leaning people cheering on multi-billion-dollar corporations to control the parameters of acceptable thought and speech online. I've heard people who have been all about freedom saying we should clamp down on protests if we don't agree with the topic of the protest. I've even heard gender-critical feminists who've been on the receiving end of awful abuse and censorship say, you know, if we had our way, we would prevent housing and employment rights for those who identify as trans. What this shows us, I think, is that the authoritarian impulse is an inherent human impulse. In other words, it manifests on the left, on the right, everywhere in between. Wherever there is religion, wherever there is an ideology, it doesn't matter. It will blossom through. When I was a kid, I remember most of the censorship was coming from, or the calls for censorship were coming from right-leaning tabloid newspapers like the Daily Mail, Daily Express, saying we need to ban this film, that book. Let's get rid of David Cronenberg's Crash or Train Spotting or whatever it might be. Those kind of calls for censorship now are coming from left-leaning publications such as The Guardian or The New Statesman, activist publications saying, you know, we just cut out certain scenes from films or comedy shows. If you watch an episode of Fawlty Towers called The Germans on BBC iPlayer at the moment, there will be a scene missing. And the scene is missing because the powers that be feel that it will stir up hatred or you shouldn't be watching that kind of thing, this very paternalistic idea. All of this is coming from now left, people who predominantly identify as the left. So what I'm saying is, I think the first thing is that when it comes to your question in terms of how do we deal with this, we should remind ourselves that liberty, the state of liberty, is an aberration. In other words, there is something about humanity that lends ourselves to the authoritarian impulse. It manifests all the time in all forms of ways. And so I think what we need to do is recognize it in ourselves. I've been trolled quite a lot online. There's a lot of people who say some really vicious things and lies about me. And I'd be lying if I'd say that in an ideal world I wouldn't just make them go away. And I'd just shut them up, and that'd be great. But my reasonable side says, actually, no, I don't want that, because that would establish a really dangerous precedent when it comes to the principle of freedom of speech. And so I think what we need to do is understand that the civilization that we've built is our defense against our baser instincts. And there is something about our baser instincts that lends itself to the suppression of others. And at the moment, what we need to recognize is that the most authoritarian force that faces us in the Western world is what we colloquially call the woke movement, critical social justice, identitarian leftism, whatever you want to call it. And you might ask, well, where does this come from? And some people say, well, it comes from the postmodernist thinkers, the French post-structuralists of the 1960s, like Foucault or Derrida. Maybe it comes from the Frankfurt School and the New Left. Maybe it comes from hyper-liberalism. A lot of people have said we've become too tolerant and the pendulum swung too far. However you want to diagnose it, what I would say is where it comes from is the enduring appeal of authoritarianism, and that seems to be manifesting at the moment in the woke. If you want to define woke, a lot of the people who self-define as woke say what they mean is being alert to injustice, especially racism, but they're missing three words there. They want to be alert to injustice and prevent injustice, and the three words they're missing is by authoritarian means. So whether their intentions are good, whether they are those bullies who sort of sneak in, they wear the guise of virtue through this movement as a means to bully others. Whatever the intention is, it's being established through authoritarianism. That's what's happening with the Irish hate speech bill. That's what happened with the Scottish hate speech bill. Similar things in Canada. And it's spreading because it's easy to just get rid of your opponents. That's the problem. So once we recognize that, once we recognize it in ourselves and how difficult and rare the idea of freedom is and freedom of speech, the idea that, to live in a country where freedom of speech flourishes is a global and historical aberration. We shouldn't take it for granted. That's what I'm saying.
Andrew, thank you. Yes, freedom is fragile. Freedom is precious. Laura, Andrew comes at these questions from a secular background, brings liberal presumptions to bear. You don't. You come at it from a more conservative, more Catholic perspective. You've had one foot in what we might call the mainstream media, another foot in this emerging ecosystem of alternative platforms that are really, I think, very successfully holding the people's feet to the fire when it comes to these kinds of questions. Tell us a little bit about your own experience over the last 10, 15 years. You've been in the trenches longer than all of us, I think.
Well, I'm not sure about that, but also it's very nice being here today. But I mean, I think I'm surprised that we've gotten through a whole maybe hour on free speech and no one has quoted George Orwell. So I'm really delighted that I'm going to get to put out that quote, because you can't discuss free speech without discussing him. And I think my favourite quote from him is, if liberty means anything, and you talked a lot about liberty, Andrew, at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. And really all I do in my work, which is, minor really compared to other people, is I like to think I sometimes tell people what they don't want to hear. And, these days, and I've definitely found over the years since I started this, and I very much fell into by mistake, is there's a whole load of things now people don't like hearing. From really, what you might say, really hot button issues over the years like Brexit, obviously the election, you've got an election in the UK now, an election coming up in the United States. When we were growing up, I was in law school with Senator Mullen, and I tell you, that was difficult. We lived through the sort of the separation, the influence of the Catholic Church lessening. So, I mean, clearly Ireland got more liberal, and that perhaps was inevitable. The more liberal people were saying, well, for decades, we didn't have a chance to say things that other people wanted to hear. But I feel very much now that, it's people on the right or Catholics that people get angry if you stick to sort of mainstream Catholic Orthodox views. But also, even I'm actually not, I do follow the politics very closely, but it's really cultural things that I am more interested in. Some things that people might think you're really unimportant, and I also like to see what are the narratives that the mainstream media like to push, because I think the censorship, industrial sensitive complex is really real, and it's important to fight that. But I think even more important than that is, the mainstream media definitely does have a grip still, although it's certainly afraid of losing that grip, and this is why they're coming for social media, where things are obviously a lot freer, and they just get, it's obviously an overall liberal trend to liberalise all sorts of things. And, for instance, they get these things into their head like women's football. Like, this is the big thing now, let's just really push it all the time. And you can say it's important, but if you're in like a general little, I'm talking about a family gathering or a friendship gathering, I'm not on Twitter, and you're like, you know what? I don't really like women's football. God, what do you mean? But it's all over RTE, and the editorial page in the Irish Times, I mean, they are just chock-a-block with the women's football right now. You're like, yeah, I'm not into it. And it's hold the phone. So, or instance, I wrote on Substack as well, and I wrote a blog against cyclists, and I even ran I don't know. And at one point I called them criminals. And this, you would be surprised of all the things that I have written, and they have been controversial, and the various TV debates I have been on, I have never received the amount of abuse I did. And the amount of it, I think it fell into some cycling forum or pistonheads.com. It did not go down well. And, what can I say? So it is interesting. And I was talking to my mother the other day, and they can't understand why I do any of this. And she said, but what's the final goal, Laura? What's the final destination? Why do you do this? And my 9-year-old just said, her final destination is to go home. And I was like, yeah, that's exactly it. And some people, it's just the joy of writing something, as I said, sometimes that someone doesn't want to hear. And it might be the cyclist one day, or it could be Aidan O'Riordan, the most annoying man in Irish context. The next day, it's just that, as I said, it's a very long list now of things people don't want to hear. You'd be surprised. But I mean, it's true that in the industrial complex is real, and all the labels now. You've got the fascism label and the far right label, and the someone called me really old on that last slide. But my favourite one is, I am in debt to Graham for this, is I hear you're a terrorist now, Father. Because the Irish government, I tell you, if they don't like you saying something, they will get out that terrorism card now and they slap it on the table. And I mean, you can't say anything now before, I hear you're a terrorist now, Father. And someone needs to step up, or someone needs to write a Substack and say, cyclists need to slow down. I don't like women's football, and can you please take down all the prize flags from all the government buildings?
Andrew, I mentioned earlier your Sunday evening show, Free Speech Nation, a show that, 10, 20 years ago, one would have expected and hoped to see on the BBC, ITV, Channel 4, mainstream channels in Ireland. And yet we don't. It would be almost unthinkable for a show like that to appear on those channels. And yet, although it's a breath of fresh air, it's a channel, GB News and your programme to some extent, that has come under fire from this strange coalition, this strange collusion of the voluntary sector, charities, or rather activist groups masquerading as charities, Hope Not Hate, and so on and so on. Leftist organisations, broadly left-wing organisations at least, that are pushing hard to get you shut down, and that are working with this quasi-governmental Quango, Ofcom, to make life very, very difficult commercially for this newly emerging phenomenon in the UK media landscape. And I think we're seeing similar behavioural institutional patterns across the West. Tell us a little bit about the battles there. You're in the trenches there. Tell us a little bit about what the challenges are and how you're confronting them, and what your hopes are for victory beyond beyond the new Starmer administration. At least I think they'll be weaponising Ofcom.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I get a lot of people sort of say, "Oh, why aren't you doing this show on the BBC?" Or so. It's like, I must have missed that offer letter in the post, because this channel got set up, and I don't know how much you know about this, but about 3 months before the channel went out, these activists, I think it was Stop Funding Hate, and had decided that we were a far right crypto-fascist organisation, and that we were going to put out all this hateful stuff, and then the channel aired, and there was none of that on it. But because they'd sort of decided that it should be on it, they kept that perspective in their head. It's a thing called belief perseverance, where you decide on something, and then even when the evidence is presented against it, you hold on to that belief because it's too painful to get rid of. And I feel that that's now something happened in 2016. Everyone went a bit insane after Brexit and Donald Trump in America, and they sort of started saying, okay, well, we're done with democracy and we're done with the marketplace of ideas, and actually the better solution is to just brand anyone who we disagree with as being outside of the Overton window. We're going to narrow that Overton window right down, and that's what's happened, which means that me, for instance, I'm someone who's been very open about my belief in liberal values and free speech, is now, because of that, routinely branded a fascist, because apparently that's what Hitler was all about, wasn't he? He wanted to seize control and force people to do whatever they wanted. And but of course that it's the concept creep of these terms, and what these terms really mean is I suppose the equivalent of witch. So I mean, I in the book The New Puritans, I spoke about the way in which a lot of this has been anticipated in the witch trials of Salem, and phrases like turf, for instance, are used as a substitute for witch, or fascist, or transphobe, or homophobe, or racist. And what this means is, whenever I hear someone called a racist or a homophobe online, I just assume it's not true. And now that word doesn't really mean anything anymore. And what this does beautifully is create incredible cover for some of the worst scum in society. And that wasn't the intention, clearly, but that's what's happened. So I think the better way to understand the culture war is to see this as a battle of language and about who gets to control the definitions of terms. And what's happened now is people can just brand you far right, and that disobliges them of the obligation to engage with your ideas, because those ideas are no longer acceptable ideas. And I think, and it's coming top down. It's coming from elites. It's coming from this is something I suppose I really want to get across is that this is, I think, unprecedented insofar as, although I said authoritarianism has always happened, I think this is the first sort of major movement that has painted themselves as being the underdogs, while at the same time having the support of the corporate world, of the Biden administration, of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, of all of the leading major institutions in the arts, in education, in the government, the police, the army, absolutely everywhere. I mean, the day that Putin invaded Ukraine, the Ministry of Defence in the UK put out a tweet about their LGBT coffee morning, where they were discussing pansexuality. This movement has incredible clout. And, we saw today in the Dial, the Progress Pride flag has been permanently etched onto a door within the building. Permanently. This is an ideological symbol, one, by the way, which a lot of gay people think represents an anti-gay movement that sterilizes predominantly gay kids. So the idea that what I'm saying, I suppose, is that the movement has couched itself as being something very progressive when it's actually very regressive. It couches itself as being liberal when it's actually illiberal. All of the words it uses are the opposite of what they actually mean. They talk about diversity, equity, inclusion. They don't mean diversity, do they? They mean homogeneity. Everyone's got to think the same way. They don't mean, we think they mean equality, but they're talking about equity, which is the opposite. We think that when they say inclusion, what they mean is we want to exclude anyone who disagrees with us. So it's difficult to beat them because you first have to learn their language and then work out what they really mean and then defeat them that way. To get back to your question, what they've done successfully, I think, is branded anyone they disagree with as evil, far-right, witch, whatever, GB News being part of it, and therefore we're no longer listened to by mainstream media outlets and that kind of thing. So that is the problem we've got to negotiate. We've got to get through this landmine of language, ultimately.
Thank you, Andrew. You say you're struggling with that challenge, but of course your viewership is going through the roof, and a lot of slots on GB News. It is clearly something the public are craving, and something it's a need that you're meeting extremely well through you and your colleagues there. Laura, another question for you. I mean, it's often said that this new kind of progressive phenomenon ideology has the hallmarks of religion. As a person of faith, do you recognize a kind of religious zeal in these ideologues?
Yeah, I mean, I think the majority of them believe what they're saying, and I mean, Andrew is certainly, and he always does it on the programme, laid out very clearly, just how successful, if we're going to label it woke, we can go with that, just how successful the woke ideology is. They do have all the main levers of power, from the corporate world to most of the government, even to right through the sports. I mean, the woke have a very clear vision of society. Christians have a clear vision of society. I clearly subscribe to that society where you're protecting the weak and vulnerable, children in particular. And the woke have a clear vision of society, and they will do whatever it takes to secure power, and much of that is through manipulating language, to impose that vision and to remake society in their vision. As I said, where there's no difference between men and women, it seems, so much so that a man can become a woman and vice versa, where they're willing to inflict really serious harms on children to achieve that vision. So the question is, what can you do to counter it? Because again, going back to Orwell, it wasn't so much that the party in 1984 wanted you to submit, it's that they wanted you to convert. And the woke want you to convert to their view, and they really want you to believe, to really, really believe that a man can become a woman on his or her say-so. And the reason why they bring out the labels, as I said, I hear you're a racist now, father, or I hear you're a terrorist now, father, or you're a fascist now, father. Myself and Andrew and other people, or as I said, J.K. Rowling being very obvious, can stand up to that kind of thing. But you shouldn't have to be as big as J.K. Rowling to withstand that kind of pressure. Because the truth is, most people like the quiet life. They don't want to go on to GB News. They don't want to be having those kind of arguments. And name-calling people, it isn't nice. It's not nice to be called a mean name. It's not nice when you're a kid in the playground. And it's not nice now. And most people, so the way they framed the narrative in terms of we're the good guys and anybody who stands up to us are the bad guys has obviously been incredibly effective because... as I said, we can see that they have secured a lot of the levers of power. So that's something you have to guard against. You have to make it very clear that they're not the nice guys. These are people who will go onto your Facebook page, and if you say something even very, mediocre mainstream, will have you fired from your job. I mean, who does that? Who would go after ordinary Joe teacher or a nurse or whatever who might have a family depending on that livelihood and say, I'm going to get that person fired? That isn't a nice thing to do. It's not a nice thing. You're not a nice person. Your views aren't particularly nice. Trying to, as Andrew said, sort of change boys who may turn out to be homosexual into girls isn't nice. Filling their bodies full of chemicals isn't nice. There's nothing nice about you. So the question then is, well, why does the government go along with it? Why are all the corporates terrified of it? Why is the HR department, who are basically O'Brien, sticking with 1984, made real? It's interesting that he was essentially a technocrat. And now the HR departments are obviously the gatekeepers, in terms of who gets hired, and they're sort of prowling along the corridors with their rainbow lanyards. And if you don't take a rainbow lanyard, then you're not an ally, and the thought police are coming for you, or you won't get the raise you wanted. And that's a concern for an ordinary person. And they absolutely should be concerned about that. So I think, it's the industrial censorship complex is really important, and it's there. The hate speech laws are obviously appalling, and they're certainly designed to chill more than they are to prosecute. But the name calling all leads to one thing, and that's that self-censorship by the ordinary person, either at the workplace or, at family gatherings or at the school gate, wherever it might be. And look, nobody likes to have an argument. Nobody wants to disrupt a family gathering. But I think actually the ordinary person saying, you know what, I'm not on board with Pride Month. Don't like it. All right, I don't like the transgender bathrooms. Or, women's football is bad. That one line is important in those private and semi-public spaces, because then other people say, she's kind of nice, and if she thinks that, then maybe it's okay for me to think that as well. And I might articulate it to another 5 people, and those 5 people articulate it to another 25 people, and then before you know it, those stupid referendums on the marriage and mother amendments fail. That's what happens. because I'll finish on this. That's a good example of grassroots support defeating what was a ridiculous proposal by the government, a very woke proposal where we were going to erase mothers on Mother's Day weekend. I mean, it's like the thick of it never existed. I mean, who would make such a stupid proposal? You'd have to be so blinded by whoever's advising you, whatever wokester, 25-year-old activist has told you that's a good idea. But the point is that was the polling numbers were all that thing was going to pass. And slowly, I think momentum built very much at grassroots level, very much in really the private sphere, the school gate, until they were failing. It was a really big win, and you just have to keep going.
Laura and Andrew, thank you so much. Before we conclude the panel, there's just enough time for some questions, I think. Paul, do you want to read them out again?
Thank you for such a fascinating discussion. So the first question is, to what extent does the panel think that wokeness is a Christian heresy? So as Tom Holland argues in Dominion, Christianity is stripped of love, God, and forgiveness.
Well, I read Dominion, although it was a while ago. I need to reread it. Yes, I mean, I think it's taking that victimology to an extreme, right? In that clearly Christianity was always flipped it in that the Romans were interested in strength and power, and Jesus came along and said, the last will go first and the first will go last. And the Romans were like, you're these crazy people that don't expose their babies on mountains, and they seem really into the widows. I mean, what's that about? And obviously it Constantine converted. And the woke, as I said, have tried to, it's still that victim ideology, but clearly what they are doing is targeting the weak, people who may be confused about their gender, unborn children in the womb, babies in nurseries who are supposedly never ever harmed, no matter how many hours they do in there while their mother goes out to work. So there's still currency in that, of course, because people have a natural instinct because of the Christian foundation to protect the weak. So they have manipulated that quite effectively. But if you look at their actions and you drill down into their belief system, they are not for the vulnerable at all.
I don't think they're the same at all. It's very simplistic to say woke is a continuation of Christianity. I think it's filled a hole, which I think has clearly happened in Ireland very much with the retreat of the Catholic Church and the influence of the Catholic Church. And it's almost as though, the Irish people wanted something to replace it. But to say that Christianity, just because of the focus on the victim, I don't think that's right. I think Jesus focused on the victim, blessed are the meek. But if he was simply saying blessed are the meek to manipulate the marginalised in order that he might become as powerful as Pontius Pilate, maybe then you could say he was woke. But that's not the situation.
I think the question asker will probably agree with you on that, Andrew. Just to clarify, I think when he says heresy, probably means something like a deviation from true Christian doctrine, like
a perversion of it. Exactly.
Sure.
Well, I think the social justice movement is a perversion of the aims of social justice. So, same thing, yeah.
The next question is such the JFK quote. So those who make peaceful change impossible make violent change inevitable. To what extent do you think Ireland's leaders are doing this by suppressing, or possibly in the future will be suppressing free speech? And to what extent do you think they intend that violence to happen? Or to what extent do you think it's just incompetence? The idea of the purpose of the system is its outcome, is the idea being toyed with there. So do you think it's just incompetence, or do you think they want an excuse to exert more power on the population?
Well, it's always about power. In general, when it comes to politicians, you shouldn't cede too much goodwill to them. This is another way to control the language. This is another way to say, Big Brother is watching you. If you want to go against our agenda, I got my hate speech law here. I don't think is necessarily a vast conspiracy there, but obviously politicians want to do certain things and they don't like being criticised. And the mainstream media is certainly goes along with them, and they don't challenge them enough. I mean, mainstream media should be they should be saying things against the government. Otherwise, they're just their PR machine. And unfortunately, RT do a lot of PR for the government. But I mean,
I think I think for some people there's a very cynical way to achieve power and clout through the current social justice movement, which is why, so I think there was a survey saying that roughly 40% of American millennials identified as LGBTQ+. So statistically, most of those people are just straight, aren't they? So in other words, now straight people with a kink can say they're marginalised, basically. And because there's power within being marginalised. So I think there's the cynical element from politicians about the securing of power. On the other hand, I think there is also a genuine misapprehension among those in power. And I think it's an unexamined premise that we do need to examine, that loads of people in authority have bought into the idea that words are like toxins, they're like spells, and if they're not regulated, they can get out of control and they can infect you. What we need to do is actually explain to these people that this has been examined. There have been 6 decades into research, into media effects theory. We know that mass media consumption does not influence public behaviour. That is a matter of fact. So all of these hate speech laws are based on a false premise for a start. And the second thing that they are based on is the idea that we should be in some way auditing human emotion. And I would put it out there that there should be no such thing as a hate speech law. Nobody can define it. And human beings, we should be free to hate. So rather than debate the intricacies of what should be on the hate speech bill, why don't we just say, you don't get to police what goes on in my head? And that's it.
Thank you so much. I'll pass back to James to introduce the next panel now.
Laura Perrins, Andrew Doyle, thank you very much indeed.